Hello, welcome everyone. We're very pleased to be back with the Authors Guild Foundation series From Manuscript to Marketplace. We're here with author Chaney Kwak and editor Joshua Bodwell. In this series, we hear from an author of a recent book, along with members of their publishing team, about their experiences pitching the book, selling it to a publisher, the editorial process, marketing campaigns, anything else that goes into releasing a book. We get a little behind the scenes look. From Manuscript to Marketplace is funded in part by the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of Governor Kathy Hochul and the New York State Legislature. We're excited, however, to be able to once again offer it virtually to a wide global audience for free. So thank you for being here. This is the first event in the series for 2021, and we'll be announcing several more events very soon, including a variety of book genres. So we're looking forward to that. But today I'm thrilled to introduce author Chaney Kwak with his editor Joshua Bodwell, editorial director of Godine and Black Sparrow Press. The book is The Passenger, Kwak's debut memoir. Beautiful book, beautiful cover. The Passenger tells a tale of his experience trapped on a cruise ship that suffered complete engine failure in notoriously rocky waters off the coast of Norway, and gets a little personal. It's a wonderful book. So Chaney, you took the cruise because you were on assignment as a travel writer.
That's right.
So clearly the book is not what you agreed to in the first place. And
Yeah.
I hear it had an unusual path to publication. So we want to hear all about that. So I'll turn it over to you two to tell us more about the book.
Great. Thank
Thanks.
you. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for attending today. It's awesome to be in the company of other writers. And as John, you mentioned, The Passenger has had kind of an unorthodox path to publication. So Josh and I can share more about that as well. But yeah, hi, I'm Chaney Kwak. I guess we should introduce ourselves. And
I'm Josh. And I'm Josh Bodwell.
Where do we start? Do you want me to ask you questions, Josh?
No, I'd love it if you would start with, why don't we start with like a foundation? Why don't you talk about the book a little bit? Just give us a little bit of a synopsis, the jacket copy, if you would.
Yeah, like John, you mentioned, it starts off on the cruise ship with that suffered an engine failure. And then it delves into more personal territory. So it is a memoir, and kind of moonlights as many different things, I'd like to think. Originally, I was commissioned to write a story, an article for Travel Magazine. But when the cruise went wrong, the magazine promptly canceled the assignment. And I really didn't think this was going to be a book, to be honest. I did take copious amount of notes just because that's how I cope with anything. In fact, I'm going to take some notes today too. And eventually I started putting together what I thought was going to be a long form essay. By then, Josh, who, by the way, in addition to being an awesome editor, is also a writer, had published this amazing essay that I really admired in Slice literary magazine. And I was hoping to get his take on it, to be honest, because I'm so accustomed to writing according to like word limits on assignment for travel magazines. And I was delving into something that I hadn't quite done. So I thought it was going to be about a 10,000 word personal essay that maybe I could place in a literary magazine. And then so I sent it over to Josh, whom I've known for a few years since we were both at the Key West Literary Seminar as two of the three recipients of the Emerging Writer Awards. So I think that's the genesis of the book. Would you say that's fair, Josh?
Yeah, I'll back it up one more step just to say that in June of 2019, when I was out west, we got to have dinner in San Francisco, and the cruise was very fresh. I mean, it was just months since it had passed, right?
3 months, yeah.
Yeah, 3 months. So it was, it took a lot of the dinner conversation of you like unpacking that experience for us. and it was riveting. So I remember, just sort of in a writerly friend way, encouraging you during that dinner to get going on it. I think you were sort of, my observation of you was that you were working toward writing something. You were doing all this sort of reading and research and thinking, but maybe you hadn't started unpacking the notes yet. And then,
quite
okay.
frankly, I thought the whole cruise debacle, and spoiler alert, nobody died, which is how I was able to write kind of a funny memoir about it, because I would feel very differently about writing a book if there had been any casualty, different kind of casualties, but we'll get into that in a second. I just thought that the whole incident was kind of a funny story I could tell at bars, but at the same time, I knew that there was something larger that I was trying to work out, and I didn't know quite what that was. And I was just, being the nosy person that I am, I was just kind of putting on my researcher hat and looking up a lot of different things, but I really didn't think that was going to be a manuscript, a book, and I certainly didn't think it was going to be my debut. So yeah,
I'll tell
Josh.
you that, well, between June and I looked today, I went back and looked at the timeline because we were both trying to remember it. Between that June of 2019 and April 7th, 2020, that's when you sent me 12,000 words. You don't know, but between that time, I thought you had a book, even though we weren't talking about it. So you sent me 12,000 words, and as you said, you thought it was a long form journalism piece, essay, but not very memoiristic. And my question back to you was, or my challenge back to you was, more Chaney. I wanted more Chaney.
Which is funny because I thought I was writing a personal essay, and I felt like, gosh, this is so personal, and so me, like, I'm sorry, Josh, like, I'm sending this to you. Little did I know that he was going to acquire the manuscript and push me to write more personal things, but we'll get to that. So just to give you kind of a rundown, I think this might be helpful. A little timeline. March 2019 is when the cruise happened. June 2019, 3 months later, is when Josh and I had dinner. And you say April 2020?
Correct. April 7th.
Okay, so April 2020 is when I sent him a 12,000 word draft of what I thought was a personal essay that he thought was a kind of a detached third person journalistic piece. And then what comes after that, Josh, in the timeline? So April 2020, yeah.
You'll love this. This surprised me. So April 7th, 2020 is when you send the 12,000 words. By April 14th, we had started an email thread about the title of the book. So in 1 week, you had accepted the fact that you were writing a book, I guess.
I remember actually getting a call from you and being kind of like, really shocked. But yeah, I mean, the way we discussed this being a book, and it is a beautiful book from Godine. Thank you again. And it's hardcover, original commissioned arts. But when we started talking about it, we really talked about it like, oh, it's going to be like this, like, one story type, or I imagined it to be kind of like stapled, like, Kinko's, not quite Kinko's, but certainly not a hardcover kind of thing that would fit in people's back pockets. And there's this series. I spent 7 years living in Germany, and there's this a publishing company called Godine. There's this there's what they call the yellow book, the Gelbe Heft, I think, which is basically this tiny little paperbacks that fits into your back pocket, and they're great for train rides. And so that's what I was imagining. So back it up, April 9th to, like, within a week, we're talking about publishing, but in my mind, I'm still thinking, okay, it's going to be like a back pocket stapled affair. Right. And then what comes after that?
We were having that discussion early on.
Yeah.
As much as we allowed ourselves to think about the finished book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because obviously there's still a manuscript that has to happen. But as much as we allowed ourselves, we did initially have conversations about a paperback original, weighing the pros and cons of that, sort of your entree into publishing. This was going to be your debut. Did it make sense? Or what made the best sense of how to bring you in? But
and
by
April, I will also say that Josh put together a cover really quickly in one day on Photoshop or Illustrator, and I loved it. But yeah, anyway, so that was happening within the first week.
It was, yeah. I mean, I just had that image in my mind. Basically, what it was for people have seen the beautiful Joe McKendry original illustration on the cover. This is not what we put together. It was sort of like if a 7-year-old had done this. Was sort of.
I disagree. I thought it looks great, actually. But anyway, so when did you send me a contract?
So we were sorting that out in the next month or so, because by early June of 2020, we had drilled down into serious back and forth about notes. So now we're June 2020, which is 1 year from your publication. And I've sent you back pretty serious notes on your 12,000 words. Mm-hmm. And this is now the most insane one. So June, and then September, you turn in a new manuscript that is almost triple in length, well over 30,000 words.
So there are two things happening there that were kind of extraordinary. One was that Godine was moving super fast and aggressive on the publishing date. And those of you who are watching who've been at it for long enough will know that, writing to publishing usually takes years and years. I've seen friends who turn in their manuscript and wait like 3-4 years before they actually get the physical object in their hands. So Godine was moving at a really fast pace already. Me, on the other hand, I've been laid off. And also there was this thing called the pandemic happening. And you can only watch the Tiger King so many times, right? So it was I was privileged enough to have this kind of like writer's residency imposed upon me. And I was able to, I had the circumstances kind of adding up to be, allowing me to really focus on this. So within 3 months, I wrote, apparently tripled the original draft. But I will also say that I think there were a lot of things on the cutting room floor that I didn't share with Josh initially that I was able to kind of throw back in there. But there was a lot of writing happening for sure.
Although I will say in that draft that arrived in September, you were still withholding key sections where you just had a little placeholder of, TK.
So the thing was writing a memoir that I didn't know about. And I should probably explain again, Josh and I met as fiction writers. So we had won the Emerging Writers Awards at the QS Literary Seminar. Like I mentioned, it was blind submission, read anonymously and all that. And we had both gotten in as fiction writers, right? And I'd always had this aspiration to debut with like a thick, like really long, like multi-generational, like novel, not a slim book of memoir. And there was like a whole learning curve involved in learning to, I guess, write a different genre. And there are parts that were just so emotionally fraught and painful that I couldn't quite bear to write them. So, but I knew, I think, having written, and tried to publish fiction for years, an embarrassingly long time, I knew that there are elements that were kind of missing. So I put them in as like, this is a placeholder for what I think should be a scene, or not even that. Sometimes it was just like section 2,
There were scenes you didn't want to write, one, but I would just say to your skill set, it's funny, I never doubted once when you were writing that hard during those months. I think your, the skill set you're able to fall back on as a professional writer, you were leaning into that. It seemed to me you were able to merge, those probably millions of words you filed professionally with your fiction writer's hat. The sense of scene and pacing and all that stuff. Just sort of the synergy is beautiful in that. And I'm ready for you
Yeah.
to turn in that multi-generational novel too, anytime. But
Well,
that's
thank you for
a different call probably.
that. Well, I will say that, like Josh mentioned, in addition to writing fiction, I was making a living as a magazine writer, and magazine writers are sort of like, oh, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it, but give me a word count and a deadline and I'll do it. You get conditioned into doing that. So it was really helpful to have an eager audience, because I never really had that for fiction, right? It was like nobody could care less. But with this book, I knew that Josh was waiting for the manuscript, and someone else had told me actually it's great to have like that one ideal reader in mind when you're writing. And I had the privilege of having that and a deadline that I constantly missed. Sorry, Josh. And yeah, so this book,
it was only those missing sections that scared me at the end.
I mean, this book
sorry, I have to give you credit for that though, that you once you'd really turned in that September 2020 draft, the shape of the book didn't change much from there, right? From the shape of the really propulsive use of time stamping it, and then playing with the time stamping where you go back years or go back in another family members. So you knew exactly where those missing pieces were. And I was biting my nails a little bit at the end. And then you just turned in, and then it was done. It was like, it seemed like over a weekend.
When did I actually turn in the missing sections? Do you know?
Yeah, it was late. It was like November.
Okay. So by then I'd missed like 2 deadlines, which I don't recommend you doing. You could really burn bridges.
No, you know what it was? We were going to do the arc. And I was like, we can't print the bound galleys with blank pages.
That's
and
right.
And it's like you rose to every challenge like that, where you just said, okay, there's a new very firm deadline. These things I haven't wanted to tackle, now I'll do it over a weekend beautifully.
Here's a trick that a lot of magazine editors use that I've learned over the years, which is that they give us writers deadlines, but they're actually padding the deadlines handsomely with extra days. And then after a while, you realize that, so you exploit it, unfortunately, and then you really, it's not good. Procrastinating is, every writer does it, but what are you gonna do? So even when I was missing the deadlines, I knew that there was going to be one that I just simply could not miss. So for the sections that were emotionally really difficult to write, I was actually carrying them around in my head, but I wasn't actually writing them down at all. They were just with me. And then in that moment of like crystal clear epiphany almost, it really was actually over a weekend. The most difficult sections, I think there are 6 or 7 of them with placeholders. On Sunday night, sorry, Josh, it was Sunday night. And I knew I had to turn them in on Monday morning, East Coast time, and I'm on the West Coast. I sat down outside on this cold day in San Francisco, and I sat down and wrote them all. And it was probably the kind of like writerly high that we all chase that, some writers seem to get often. I certainly hadn't felt that way in such a long time, years and years. And that's the kind of moment we live for. And I miss it. Wish I could have that again. But because I had been kind of revising that in my head so long, that I was able to sit down and type them out and send them over to Josh, who then turned the whole thing into a galley.
Yeah, I mean, with writing, with every assignment is slightly different, whatever it takes, right? So yeah, it would have been nice to coast into that deadline, but what you sent took as long as it took, I guess. If I can have it be zen about it now in hindsight, rather than maybe that you ruined that weekend for me or something, where I was just sort of pacing. But you those weren't very important. These weren't things like you hadn't researched or needed to call someone back or things like that. They were important connective tissue to the book. And if you had to think that long about it before you could then crystallize it, fine. The book's all the better for it.
Yeah, and we don't mean to be cagey about it, and it's still hard for me to even talk about those sections. Um, but I recognize that and also those were actually um, there was an element that Josh really pushed for that I fought. I'm sorry about the traffic outside, but there was an element that I really fought Josh on quite a bit, push back and push back. And looking back, he was absolutely correct in asking for that missing puzzle piece that I wasn't willing to reveal because it was so personal. But I don't think the book could have really stood without that connective tissue that's deeply personal, because it went from being kind of a WTF funny story with a lot of research about a cruise disaster that never was to become something else because of those sections. And I'm sorry, I'm not going into details. You're just gonna have to buy the book. Sorry, but when you do read it, many libraries carry the book. Please, if you ever get around to reading it, you'll recognize what sections we're talking about. I think it's pretty obvious. Don't you think, Josh?
I think it's extremely obvious. And I mean, I hope I would have, I've had the great, so Chaney has mentioned, it was 2015 when we met in Key West, and Chaney and I and a third emerging author, Jay Deshpande, the three of us have had a text thread going since January of 2015 that's unbroken to this day. So I part of what I knew was missing was knowing Chaney, but I think it was missing too in terms of just a purely, I think I would have known if I didn't know you as deeply as I know you, but it just seemed all the more glaring because of knowing you.
Yeah, I wonder if you had been working with an author that you hadn't known personally, I think you still would have pushed for something. You might not have known exactly what was missing, but you'd have said like, there's a lack there. There's a detachment that's not working.
I think I was actually more careful pushing you because of our friendship. Because I didn't want a literary want to sort of overstep a boundary, with maybe a personal boundary. So, I mean, I think as we've seen readers respond to this book, I have to, thank you for being willing to go there.
I mean, it comes at a cost, I think, for sure, personally, like emotional cost. And I think memoirs carry a certain casualty for sure. It does impact your personal life, but that's the kind of bargain you make. Or you decide not to publish because, I've taught writing where there are people who write for the sheer pleasure of writing, and I admire that so greatly, but I guess that's not what this seminar is about. It's about publishing. So
well, let me ask you this, and now that it's been out for what did we say, about 4 months?
4 months exactly.
How has it been, from my perspective, as I've watched the reaction to it? You and your story are so crucial to 99.9% of the response. They're not like, oh, he nailed the helicopter lift scene, which you did, by the way. But you get my point that, the feedback has been, how's that been for you?
Yeah, definitely. You share, I think I've always maintained that publishing can be an act of generosity, and that you share a part of you, without asking for anything in return, really, because when you send out a book or any piece of writing, really, you have no control over how that's going to be received, what that's going to do in the world. You just send it out there. So when you write something personal, it is kind of an act of giving away, or giving too, depending on how you approach it, I guess. I was very, very self-conscious about, well, is this like navel gazing? Is this really narcissistic? Like, can you pull me back, Josh? I was kind of, trying really hard to be personal without being self-obsessed or indulgent. But I have to say, the responses that I've gotten from readers, and that's been interesting too, aside from like Amazon and Goodreads reviews, which I do not read, I did not heed the advice from my published friends at first, and then pretty soon that became very obvious that it was not good for my mental health, so I stopped reading, and I'm better for it. But I do have people reaching out to me, and it's the personal aspects that really seem to resonate with people, either about myself, or there's a really short section about my mom that a lot of readers have reached out to me about. So that's
good.
very special. And yeah, I don't know. It's I was actually, when we were talking about this just now, Josh, I was also thinking like people in the audience, most people probably wouldn't be friends with, someone working in publishing. This is very unusual, right? But when I think about the path to this, like we both entered this competition blindly, and that literary seminar brought us together. But it wasn't about networking. When I met Josh Bodwell, you were not an editorial director. You were another writer just like me. And yeah, I mean, over the years, I think I realized I could really count on you for good advice. And, you're probably one of the most well-read people I know. So I turn to you for a lot of advice. But I think oftentimes people think of like publishing or the trade, writing trade, quote unquote, as like, oh, you have to network and, all that stuff. And I don't know, actually, like I've never lived in New York. I've never actually like networked with editors for the sake of it. That I ended up publishing The Passenger as my debut seems a little bit like a fluke to me, actually. Like
You're like the opposite of a networker, and that even once I was in this position and we had a foundational friendship, I don't think you ever in a million years would have sent me a manuscript to consider for publication, right?
It would be the opposite, actually.
Right.
like I would,
Yeah, you were sending me an email as a friend, even on my Gmail, not my work account, all those things. And to the other side of that, I want to say too that like just because you were sending me something doesn't mean, and you were my friend, doesn't mean I would be, considering publishing it, which is to say that at the end of the day, it all comes down to the work. Like I could love you as a friend and support you as a writer and still not want to edit and publish you.
There are certain challenges to having your friend as an editor, and for sure. I think I really appreciated the kind of loving care that Josh took to every single sentence. There are times, I think, when emotions ran high because that's what happens with publishing, and also because doubly so because we're friends. And I think, that's something that you also have to navigate as a writer too. How do you maintain that friend, professional relationship and not get your heart broken?
Well, it speaks to the two sort of they're not like so siloed that there's a hard wall between them, but sort of the work of the manuscript and the work of the publishing the book, right? So you and I having those conversations about iterations of the cover and blurbs and jacket copy, and those things are about the product of the book, right? Not about the content of the book, how different those are.
Those are different.
Yeah, they're more there's a lot of other outside forces that are sort of breaking our bubble of fun of working on the manuscript.
Can you actually talk about that? Because I feel like you've done a good job shielding me from like the business side of publishing a manuscript. But
that's good.
What were your concerns?
I think part of my work is part of the work. I think part of an editor's work is to sort of walk the tightrope of like shielding their author, but also the author shouldn't feel like they're in a vacuum and don't know what's going on. And you're unique too in that you're very smart and do a lot of research. And if I mention something to you at the beginning of a 30-minute phone call, by the end of the call, you've already pulled up like 5 websites about that thing we're talking about. So which is wonderful. I say it as a compliment. Well, let's see. So I would say that, for every time you and I talked about the subtitle, there might have been, if we talked about 5 subtitles, there were probably 15 or 20 discussed, right? So it's always a matter of like, I was trying to funnel down and filter what you were getting.
But also you're doing some market research, right? Because you're testing, booksellers or reps.
Sure.
Is that right?
Sure. And then there was excitement around you and your body of work. And that was part of the discussion we had behind the scenes about moving the book to a hardcover, for instance, right? Because for months, really, from that April conversation to almost the fall, I think it was going to be a paperback original. And we thought, this is smart. This is a way to, introduce Chaney and maybe avoid the risks or expense of a hardcover rather. But as the manuscript grew and as the project fully formed, plus the excitement around you as the debut author, it became important then to do the opposite, which is to say, we need to honor this by putting it in a hardcover, so people know this is an important book to pay attention to.
And I really didn't understand the significance of a hardcover. I'm not in the publishing trade and all that, but just the feeling of touching the book when I first opened the box versus when I first got my ARC, that was very different. There's something about hardcover that's just, yeah.
Do you remember you were hedging in the beginning? You were trying to like talk me out of hiring Joe McKendry to do the original artwork. You were sort of like, I don't want you to waste money on my book.
Disappointing people is probably the greatest fear in my life. Yeah. So I just really didn't want you to expect a lot out of the passenger and then be disappointed by, and in extension, disappointed in me. But here's something that's wonderful that happens once you put a book out, which is that you realize it's not you. The book is not you, and it's something that you've harbored. And I feel honored that I was able to have played a part in creating it and sending it out to the world. And I wish it all the best. But this book is not me. It's it has its own life, and it goes out into the world and to libraries, and it's going to be read and misread, and it's wonderful. And I think after about a month or 6 weeks after the publication date, it was almost like I woke up one day and I was like, oh my God, I feel like me again, as opposed to, being this promotional machine who was trying so hard to impress, people with the book. And I think in many ways I saw it as a referendum of me as a person, Right. And then one day, that feeling just stopped like that.
Yeah, I would say it's important for other writers listening to understand that very serene place that you just described was a process for you, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, leading up to that, for sure, social media, I make no secret of it in my book that I'm very disdainful, but I was also a total hypocrite leading up to the publication date, just doing a lot of Instagram things and, hating a lot of it until at some point I kind of stopped hating it. And I have to give Josh credit for it, during a time when a lot of publishing houses would have been kind of horrified if the author stopped promoting the book. About 2 weeks before, I think, the publication date, I told Josh, dude, I can't do this. This is not good for me. So I'm just gonna step away from Instagram and everything. I don't want to do this. I don't want to do interviews. And actually, Josh was okay with that, And I think because I was able to recharge for 2 weeks, that when the publication date came, I was super calm,
Oh my God, you were. By the time, so I'm trying to remember when because there was a difference between when you recorded with Noel King for NPR and when it ran. Mm-hmm. Where was it in that 2 week window? Do you remember? It was right around pub day.
No, Noel.
It was right after. It was
way after. Yeah.
Right. It was a couple weeks after. Yeah.
Yeah, so we didn't
Right.
even get a call from NPR until after the publication date
Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
variety of reasons, right? Like big five books have lead times for like years and years. They have everything lined up. I have a friend who knew she was going to be a Good Morning America book, pick for like a year, but she couldn't talk about it and all that.
Wow.
For us, it was very different. Like it was like roll with the punches kind of thing where, oh, NPR called. Awesome. Okay, sure. I'll put a blanket over my head and talk to them, because my apartment's really echoey. But all that
so
happened after
there's
the
a
publication date.
right.
So
And there's a shielding piece too. I mean, I'd been working with Chad, the producer, Noel King's one of Noel King's producers, for probably 5 or 6 months, right? But it's always a matter of it had to work its way up to being a hot item on their plate, and that was around pub date.
Yeah,
but
and
that's
I
another
didn't need
example
to
of sort of shielding you, right? Which is like
exactly.
carefully like telling you like this might happen with Noel King, but I don't want to tell you until we have an actual interview on the table. We did a lot of. I remember the 2 weeks before too. We were talking a lot about the idea of. I think you had understandably put a lot of focus on the actual pub day itself, and I was trying to sort of stop you from putting so much emotional and physical attention on that and think about. So we're using like I was using like cheesy dad metaphors, like think of the marathon, not the sprint.
Which I
right?
love. I love Josh and his dadism. So yeah, that's another thing that I think you must go through a lot with debut writers, which is that, I think of like, oh my God, if I don't make a splash on June 8th when the book drops on Tuesday, the book's just going to sink into the bottom of the ocean and that's going to be it. But actually books have a very different, like they take on their own lifespan. And I really hope The Passenger will leave like a long, quiet wake instead of like, a splash and like disappear. Yeah. So
it's always about in an essay years ago, Stephen King made a great analogy about buzz versus hype, and hype is sort of bought and paid for, and buzz is organic. Buzz is like seeing your friend at the coffee shop and telling them something, and hype is a billboard, right? So there can be hype, in the initial weeks and months up to a pub day. But a book's real life is often about the buzz, right? That a book's lifespan. I mean, one of my favorite examples is Andre Debus III's House of Sand and Fog, which, Andre had published 2 well-received but low selling books before that. And House of Sand and Fog was picked by Oprah when it was a paperback, right? So think about, you're 4 months into your publication. Andre was a year plus into the publication of that book. And thought, well, it's done okay, and then bang, one morning, it's an Oprah pick. Life's changed.
And I've been really humbled to see The Passenger getting picked up by independent booksellers' newsletters, and that's the kind of stuff that just kind of happens organically 3 months after publication, or just the other day, Josh emailed me this email or newspaper item from Missouri. Because the small town there publishes, I guess, in their newspaper, like every book that the county library acquires. And, it was just so awesome to see the book make its way to a corner of the world that I'd never been to. And it didn't happen the day before publication, the pub date. It happened like 4 months after. So that's one thing that I learned, I think, that it's not like a finish line, actually, It feels that way, though.
Well, there has to be a little bit of a finish line in terms of, some of the deadlines we were talking about. And, you did get a lot of great pre-publication press in terms of, Publishers Week, not Kirkus, Forward, et cetera, those sort of places. So there's a little bit of that, but then like you're saying, it's always that evolution, that at the same time it's popping up in Joplin, Missouri, that 3 Lives and Company in the Village in New York City, not only one bookseller, but 2 is raving about it in their newsletter, and that's a beautiful thing, that they're not, independents who aren't just promoting the book that came in that week, but promoting what they read and want to turn other people on to read.
And
It's
these
so
are
beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very humbling. And these are part of this domino chains, that, I don't even know how they got, set off, but I understand based on talking to a lot of my friends who've published with smaller presses, it's very unusual then, that Josh does this for his authors. He just really goes out there and hustles so much. The same person who edited my manuscript is also out there talking to like submitting the book. He got me my blurbs, which I didn't know was unusual. I was just like, oh yeah, that's what like publishing houses are for. And then my friends looked at me like, are you insane? Like nobody does that for you. So unusual in many ways, but not improbable, right? There are other editors like you out there too. So
I hope so.
You really like talking about kind of traditional like writer editor relationships that aren't quite common anymore. I mean, you model yourself after I think the kind of like tradition of editors really working with writers, and I have to say The Passenger was kind of like that, where it's by Chaney Kwak says that, but it's very much every step of the way Josh was there with me. And I suppose like it's not that common anymore, but it was never a proposal either. I think that happens sometimes when you propose like a nonfiction book and then the editor has a say in how to shape the book. That wasn't quite that either. You gave me a lot of freedom to just kind of run with it. But having that kind of one ideal reader in mind definitely helped me fine tune it, even though I fought you every step of the way.
I hope that made it better.
I hope so too. I mean, I think so, but it's up to the readers to decide. And anyway.
Well, they'll never see those drafts.
Oh, I hope not. Hi, Johnny.
Hi. So we have some time left for Q&A. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. It's really interesting stuff. First, I'll ask, we got a lot of questions related to agents. So Chaney, you did all this without an agent?
Yeah, so I have an agent ish. And my understanding, I used to think that agents would just hold your hand and like stroke your hair and tell you like you're brilliant and all that. And I understand that's less common now. And I've noticed more and more of my peers getting agents for specific book projects rather than for lifetime. And I saw that within my sort of coming of age as a writer, where I think when I first started trying to get an agent, that was still very much the model. Whereas now I see more and more of my friends getting signed on to do like, this novel that you wrote, I will represent you, or like this. So I have an agent for who wants me for certain kind of book projects. The Passenger was not one of them because I was never meant to be a book. And when I actually did bring it up to her, she said, it's not quite something I can represent, and I appreciate that candor too, because she could have just as well said like, oh, you already have a publisher? Awesome. Like let me put my name on it, but she didn't. So.
And Josh, I mean, does Godine normally work with agents, or agents typically required? And what do you like in an agent? What do you like out of the agent-editor relationship?
I like agents who are just as passionate about their authors as I am about the authors I work with, which is to say, I definitely receive agented submissions where I'm not sure if the agent has read the manuscript or not, and I can always tell the difference between, we're all trying to. So a lot of what Chaney and I were talking about is like we're when the book is published, we're trying to make our enthusiasms public, right? So and I'm trying to get people as excited in The Passenger as I am as the editor. So I admire and appreciate agents who can do that with the manuscripts that they're giving me. That also have an understanding of what we are and are not publishing. And I love a good package, which is a not just an email with, I think you'll like this novel, but, really a nice proposal. It doesn't have to, it doesn't have to include bullet points, but it has to include some context to help me think about the book that they're proposing. And I get both. I mean, I get one sentences from agents and a manuscript. And I just think, okay.
What percentage of your authors are agented or manuscripts that you publish? I'm curious.
Yeah, I know you are. I can see you leaning
I'm
in.
curious about everything. Well, I'm nosy,
Yeah,
you know that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one beautiful thing that happens where there's not an there wouldn't necessarily be an agent involved is if Chaney came to me, for instance, and said, I really want you to look at this manuscript. I'd put my name on this. I'd blurb this book. This is a friend of mine. So that author coming to me, Chaney is a way the gatekeeper, right? Like I trust his taste and his readers. So our authors help us find other authors, which is a beautiful thing. Percentage wise, so what I'd say is almost always when we work with an author who is unagented, it is because we've gone after the writer, which is to say, it's not unlike Chaney, which is to say, I knew Chaney had this book in him, so I helped initiate the project to what it became. Those people don't always have an agent. And then sometimes there's a manuscript that's out there that I know that I love, and it is represented, but I've been dealing with the author already. And then the agent comes in and says, great, show me the contract and I'll go through it. Percentage-wise, it's hard to tell.
What about agents that you've never worked with / never heard of? Would you entertain packages from people, agents?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's all about the work, right? Like, I don't care about, the name of the agency or the prestige of the agency or, that they published someone incredible in the 70s and 80s, but haven't done much since. It doesn't matter. It's all about the work, and we open everything and read everything. So I'm happy to be surprised.
Now, on marketing and publicity, so Godine is a esteemed but not huge publisher. Can you tell us who does what there as far as PR?
So on this book, so we do a mix of in-house and freelance, which is to say the publisher, David Allender, and I are sort of making that decision, some stuff that he wants to do. With Chaney's book, for instance, he wanted to do a lot of work buying advertising with like regional independent bookstore collectives, so on the West Coast, sort of targeting some of that stuff. That was a way to sort of get the proverbial bang for our buck as a small independent, we felt like this was a book independents were going to embrace, and it's been very validating to see that they have. So to spend money talking directly to those booksellers, because we don't have the budget to take out a full page ad in the New Yorker or something, focus on the people that are going to put the books in hand. On different books, we will bring in an outside publicist based on what the needs are. It's, Chaney brought out a book in the middle of the summer when things were getting better with the pandemic, right? It wasn't June 2020, but things still aren't amazing. So we knew, for instance, that, well, we don't need to bring someone in to book Chaney a big tour across the country, right? So Chaney and I had those discussions. What was he up for and willing to do, and what would feel like a success, right? Which was, and we I don't know how we landed on, we landed on this idea of really good in conversation partners and breaking it down by time zone. Because you also said, Jay, like you didn't want to do 35.
It was a joke, Josh. I made a joke like, oh, you know what? I don't want more than one reading per time zone. And you're like, that's a great idea. What? So we ended up having a launch event, 4 launch events. And really, I mean, I've seen some writers do like 20 Zoom events, and I don't know how they do it. 4 were exhausting as they were. I also
you launched with Daniel Handler at Green Apple. I mean, they were all like really, yeah, they were all really meaningful, and your conversation partners were important, and they were great bookseller partners. So I did that stuff. To answer your question, Johnny, I did that because it wasn't necessary. And then your amazing friend just decided to sort of complement the work that I was doing with editors, and
Right.
just said, I want to help my friend Chaney, and I should say she's a specialist and has a background in PR.
So she's a travel PR travel publicist that I've known from working for travel magazines, and her name is Catherine Han, really tireless PR agent, and she just volunteered her time because I could never afford her. She usually works with luxury hotels, but she doesn't work with the usual book trade or book PR outlets, but I think that helped us have these two very complementary experts, because Josh could go after the literary establishment, or I don't want to say that, but literary outlets.
Well, yeah, like I was focused on getting you excerpted in
Right.
LitHub and newspapers,
Right.
and that's yeah.
And Catherine got talked to the New York Post, which I kind of make fun of the New York Post in my book, and I was like, Catherine, are you sure about this? But the interviewer was really kind, and we got a nice interview. So this is all to say, like, it does take a village, but I've heard of friends who had to write to 100 different bookstores. I didn't have to do that. Godine did that for me. And I didn't pay an external PR agent. That actually, even friends who go with like a big 5 publisher have had to actually pay out of their own pocket. I didn't pay per se, but I did have some PR help for a couple of months around the launch date, and that was incredibly helpful. So
it was, especially because she brought that laser aspect to it.
Laser, yeah.
Now, I told you I would ask about social media. So we often hear that authors don't need a platform, but of course it's good if they have one. That if you don't like social media, just pick one that you're most comfortable with. Do you have other thoughts on what authors should be doing, and how important a platform really is to a book getting acquired, and whether that actually translates to sales? I guess Josh.
Yeah. I was just watching him bite his fingers.
Yeah, Josh, did you sign me on because I have such a huge social media following?
Yeah, we just knew you were just a wizard, and you lived and died for it. Yeah. No, I mean, God, I think, as you said, we are a small independent. We are a different kind of press, and I'm just trying to go through my head. I mean, obviously, we look at an author's platform when we're considering their book. If we're in love with a manuscript, I can't think of an example when it would all fall apart because they didn't have X Twitter followers. A few months, 6 months before Chaney's book came out, we published a debut novel by Meredith Hall called Beneficence. 70-year-old and her debut novel. She had been a New York Times bestselling memoirist, but this was her first novel at 70. She's never turned on Twitter. She doesn't care about Twitter. She cares about writing. Geraldine Brooks, the Pulitzer winner, sent me a fan letter and a blurb because she loved the hardcover so much. I mean, that's the kind of book Meredith writes. So that's the kind of book we want to publish and we care about. So the fact that Meredith wasn't going to be on Twitter and would weep if she had to tweet, it doesn't matter. At the same time, it also doesn't hurt, right? There's no silver bullet. All of these things are part of doing the best you can for the specific book and the specific author. So I don't feel like there's any prescriptive, this many followers or this number of social media platforms or that sort of thing. You have to do what's right for the book and the author.
And something that another writer friend told me that really kind of freed me mentally was he said, if you don't have a following, you're not going to build one for the book. It's just not going to happen. And that liberated me from feeling pressure to wade into the cesspool that is Twitter. Right. And I told Josh I was only going to do things that would amuse me on Instagram. And I think I kind of lost sight of that a couple of weeks leading up to the pup date, so that I kind of burned out and stopped altogether. But I think I was.
Well, I just want you were very smart. I think that there was a moment where I was like, okay, we're building some graphics. Do you want this? Do you want that? And you would sort of push back and say, like, no, you guys do your social media. That's from the house. but you, Chaney, are going to do things in your voice and your aesthetic. And I think that was really smart. That was a really good lesson for me about sort of how those worked together. Because you would do these very funny posts that a publishing house would never put out, where you were sort of making fun of you yourself getting some publicity or something, you know?
I mean, yeah, I think you have to, yeah, you got to be yourself. If you put on airs, people know. And if you're just doing like advertising or marketing, people can smell it from miles away. So, and it's so easy to just swipe away.
Yeah.
So I think the important thing is like, you know, if you're finding yourself amused by what you're doing or interested, great. But you know, what are you gonna do? There's so much noise out there. So
I would say, right. And if you want to live with yourself the next day, authenticity matters. And you were being your authentic self.
Still struggling with some of that, but you know, don't have to get into that.
It was so on brand, Chaney.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any alternatives to social media that either of you would recommend for an author, such as blogging, blog tour, email newsletter?
We do a lot of email newsletters at Godine that have been great. And there were multiple times with Chaney's book where, I mean, I care a great deal. I mean, look, this is my Selectrix typewriter behind me here. I mean, I care a great deal about, you know, print and the printed words. So I was also doing letters, you know, to booksellers. We did some mailers, you know, just like a single folded mailer to a lot of independent booksellers. So we were sort of mixing, and especially during the pandemic, it just felt like, oh, I don't want to make someone open another email, you know, let's send them this beautiful printed piece with this fantastic cover on it, you know, and they're going to be happy to hold that and like are more likely to read that than they are, you know, email 55 in their unopened email list. So we were mixing it. We were going old school during the pandemic, and we continue to do that at Godine and Black Sparrow.
There are three things that I would recommend to writers who are publishing or close to publishing. One is enlisting your loved ones without bombarding them with emails. I sent out 2 emails total, one on the night eve of the publication day with clear like bullet points of what they can do to help. And it was kind of cheeky. It was like, hey, like, I know I'm asking for a favor, but if you do them all, like, I'll make you dinner. So, you know, do these things. And those action items were like, contact your local independent bookstore and innocuously ask if they're carrying Chaney Kwak's The Passenger. You know, go to your local library's webpage and request a copy. Things like that. And then a list of all the events that I was doing on Zoom. So I would recommend doing that because one of those friends turned into be, maybe this is triggering, a super spreader. It's too early maybe, but so she sent out that email and that ended up getting like over 1,000 views because she was just like forwarding, and that was actually getting forwarded again. So that was really awesome. Another thing I would recommend you do is I actually handwrote postcards to independent bookstores. So it was kind of a 2-step approach. Josh provided me with the mailing labels of what he considered to be the 200 top independent bookstores in the country. I got postcards made. Well, actually, no, Josh Godine's team made the design, but my relative gifted me postcards as a gift. And then I hand wrote all of them to those bookstores. And I recommend this not because it affects the bottom line, because I'll never know if, you know, bookstore ordered more books because of the postcard or not. I don't even know if they got to the bookstores, to be honest, because there was no return address. Why I recommend this is because it almost became like a love letter to the book sellers at large. And at first it was kind of dreadful. I was writing like these postcards thinking like, oh, it feels like I'm pandering. Like, what do I even say? But I think halfway through, I started really loving like Googling the bookstores, learning about the owners, like their families who work there, and just learning more about them. It was almost like going into like 100 different bookstores without leaving my chair. And that was really awesome. There's something really comforting about that. And, you know, I was genuinely thankful that they're putting up this great fight because, you know, being booksellers is not an easy job. Nobody does that for, you know, just the money, right? So that was mentally really good for me and a really good way to kind of calm my nerves leading up to the pub date. So I recommend authors do that, just if anything, for therapeutic reasons. And of course, the third thing I was gonna say, I forget. Sorry. There's something else,
well,
but yeah.
we have a few questions looking for advice for a new writer, specifically if there's anything you would suggest to someone shopping a memoir. And in general, without an agent, would you say that your magazine publications help you find that agent that you do have? Josh, do you scout short stories and things like that? You said you often approach writers.
I'll let Chaney go first, and I'll come to that one.
So I found my agent not through my magazine work, but I was a scholarship recipient at Breadloaf, and I met her there. But the Passenger came together without her involvement. But as a result of another literary conference, really, where Josh and I are both, emerging writers. So I recommend, if anything, to apply to those things. There was a time when I was just applying to everything and anything that didn't have an application fee. That makes me sound so cheap, but yeah, QS does not. So I just sent him my manuscript, and that's a great way to be quote unquote discovered or to be connected, I guess, to, just keep applying. And it's super subjective, right? I'm sure, Josh, you've been rejected before. I don't know about you. I've been rejected many times, but you just keep at it. In terms of shopping around the memoir, I'm not the right person, I guess, because I didn't actually shop it around. I talked to Josh and thinking that it was a magazine article. So Josh, what do you think? What makes you say yes to a memoir as opposed to, this is a definite no?
Specificity, uniqueness. I think I was pushing, I think people have read with The Passenger, you eventually got comfortable and made it so personal it was universal, and I think people forget that about memoir often, that it really does need to be specific and personal. We've all got a story to tell, and all those stories are worth telling. There's a difference between that and it being something that can be brought out into the world as a published book, I think. So I would never say that someone doesn't have, we all have a memoir in us. But I think we all have to also think about whether or not that memoir has a place in the larger conversation. So I'm trying to be both supportive of the memoir and also sort of threading the sort of realities of the memoir.
Well, Vivian Gornick said it's not a matter of what happened to the writer, but what the writer makes of what happened, right? That's what makes a memoir. Beautiful. So really, it's not... Beautiful. I mean, if you think about it, if you look at the log line of The Passenger, a cruise ship loses power, nobody dies. That's not a book, really,
Right. Well said. Yeah, well, beautiful. Yeah. And then to your question about short stories, I mean, I'm certainly, anytime I'm looking at short stories, essays, newspaper articles for that matter. We just published a book a month ago, debut nonfiction book by a journalist. And I had been following his journalism on a specific story for, I don't know, half a decade probably, and then called him and said, I bet there's a lot of this story that you can't tell in the newspaper for various reasons. So yeah, I mean, anything that is appealing to me, I'm thinking about whether or not it's a book. To writers, I would just say, every editor who loves storytelling is doing that. So get your short work out there. Absolutely. It's so crucial.
Well, thank you. I think we'll wrap there. We've gone over an hour. Thank you so much, Chaney and Josh. Everyone, The Passenger is a wonderful book, and it's a great book for writers to read, I would say. So there's even more insights to the process inside the book, for sure.
Oh yeah, I forget about that aspect. The book is actually about writing a book in some ways. So
yeah.
Well, how did I forget that? But thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Such a treat.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a good day. Thanks.
Thanks, Johnny.